To the Amherst Women's Club. We're happy that you are here today, and we are both live here in the clubhouse, and we are on Zoom. So wherever you are, and you're watching us, we're glad you decided to spend a lovely November afternoon with us. So thank you. I'd like to thank our hostesses for today's tea, Louise Riley, Emily Belt, AJ Lardner, Norma Halleck, and Catherine Lombardi. And also, I will be sending around a sign-up sheet. This hasn't happened this year yet, but this is very important. We need to have volunteers to make tea, to bring the goodies to eat. If we don't get volunteers, I don't know how we can continue doing it. So I will start passing this around. And also, I would like to introduce a new member to our club, fairly new member, who has taken on the job of the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, and she is also the person in charge of our Thursday evening meetings. Well, it used to be Tuesday, but we've decided to move it once a month to a Thursday evening. So tonight, Batista will be telling us about both the Thursday evening meeting, our next Ways and Means event, and any other thing that she can talk to us about. Okay, thank you.
So this Thursday coming up, we have a very special guest as our speaker. It's actually Marianne Lombardi, Catherine's daughter. And Marianne is actually an extremely fascinating woman. She does entrepreneur coaching for small businesses, so women in small business. And so she's going to come on Thursday to be here very few days from DC to kind of give us information on what she does. I'm going to just kind of read a little bit about what she's doing. We'll talk about her executive and entrepreneur coaching, and she specifically focuses on how to close the confidence gap and help women and non-binary individuals align clarity and confidence in order to build the business of their dreams. So that's going to be our topic on Thursday. Hopefully you guys can come and support Marianne in her speech and her wisdom and knowledge on small businesses. So I did actually send this out in an email. So if you guys have need the information, it'll be Thursday at 6 p.m. 6 p.m. from 6 to 6:30 is a glass of wine and some cheese, and then she goes on to speak right at 6:30. We also have, so I'm doing a lot of activities and events, trying to bring more things into the club. We are going to be doing a Ways and Means fundraiser, but this is because of Stella Levski, if you were here. She was an inspiration to Tina Sheep, who's going to be a new member, and Ann Belt, Emily Belt's daughter. They wanted to do a concert similar to that, but with kids. So we're going to be raising money for the fundraiser and the grants for the service agencies on December 12th at 2 p.m. Everyone's invited to join us. It is going to be $20 to help us raise funds for the Ways and Means. We are also going to have tulips for sale for advertising the Spring Flower Show in March. I think it's the weekend before spring, before the first day of spring, and we'll send that date out. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you. And I'm going to ask LJ to come up and make an announcement about our December dinner, which we haven't had for a year or so. So, LJ.
We are preparing our usual holiday dinner as every year. It is going to happen on Saturday, 4th of December. And I would ask you to sign your name, number of people that will come, and also the dish or the dessert you would like to contribute for this event. So please, we're not bored to start.
Thank you, LJ. And please notice that we have decided to change the date to a Saturday. Traditionally, since I've been a member, it's always been on a Monday evening, but we're going to try it on a Saturday evening just to see if we get a better response. So let's see what happens. As you know, I just mentioned we are also on Zoom. So those of you who are joining us on Zoom, we're glad to have you And remember, at the end of our speaker's presentation, if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, raise your hand, and our IT person, Hank, will call on you. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Charlene Moran, who is going to introduce our speaker.
Hello. First order of business, phones off. Everybody have their phones off. I am delighted that our guest speaker today is Robert Weir, freelance journalist and author of Who Knew? Roadside Revelations in Western Mass, published by Amherst-based Weir's Press. Those of us who have lived in the Valley for many years likely think we know much of its history and quirky stories. But Mr. Weir has taken these stories much further by relating their local history to within the context of larger social and political developments in the U.S. Mr. Weir has had a career of almost 4 decades teaching history at high schools and colleges across the Valley, including UMass, Amherst, Smith, and Mount Holyoke. Let's welcome him and learn more about, and I quote from the book's introduction, the Western Mass eccentricities, quirks, and social history that make the region unique. Let's welcome.
I will take my mask off to speak, and then during the question and answer, I'll probably put it back on because I have terrible hearing. So if you ask me a question, I'll probably walk towards you. I'm not attempting to violate your personal space or anything like that. Thank you so much for coming out on such a gorgeous day. This is the kind of day that when I was teaching before my retirement, students would always bug me, can we go outside, Dr. Weir? The answer was always no, because not a thing got done until you actually yielded to that. But anyhow, thank you for coming out on such a gorgeous day. And so now, like knock the batteries out. Okay. There's a propitious start, huh? And then Hank is going to put this up on full screen for us, and we'll go from there. Yeah.
Mr. Genius.
It's just a matter, I think, yeah. Okay. So, Hank, if we can make that full screen, I'd appreciate it. So, I don't like to read PowerPoint slides to people. I figure that most of us probably learned how to do that in 2nd grade. However, if you're sitting in the back and there's something that you would like me to focus on, just kind of throw your hand up in the air, and I'll highlight what's on the slides. But I'm going to pretty much do a highlight of what's on the slides anyhow. We're going to start off by doing something I will not do unless you ask me to do at any other time, which is I'm going to read to you, in this case from the introduction of the book, because it kind of sets the standard for what this is all about. And appropriately, the first line is something I'm going to be talking about today. Who knew that an elaborate fountain in Lee, Massachusetts was part of a plot to wean citizens from the allure of demon rum? Why does a 20-foot concrete milk bottle sit on the front lawn of an elementary school in Whately? Did you know that one of the most influential visionaries in Western history lived most of his life in Chicopee Falls? Whose crazy idea was it to build a sprawling fairy tale house in the Berkshires hamlet of Tyringham? Who decided to associate Mohawk Indians with metal teepees with wooden doors? Who knew? Roadside Revelations from Western Massachusetts tells the stories behind the follies, oddities, and curiosities that folks stumble upon when they journey through the region. Many are things that even locals no longer see and probably never knew much about in the first place. Commonplace things have a habit of sliding into the blurry background of our everyday routines. When Northampton friends asked me for an example of this book's content, I mentioned the monument on West Street. Invariably, they ask, what monument? Yeah, that's kind of what this book is about, in a nutshell. So going to do today is start with this, which is an overview of where I'm going to go with this today. I'm a person who's written quite a few books, most of which were kind of weighty academic tomes. This one was actually fun to write. It's not one that I wrote because I had to, but because I wanted to. And it was a delight to focus on the things that we no longer see, or as I say, never saw in the first place. And it was kind of nice because I got to write this with a little bit of a cheeky tone too, which fits my personality quite well. But as a historian, I also wanted to know the why behind these things. When you pass something that's weird, there's usually a why behind it. Not always, but usually, and that's what I wanted to do as well. And I also wanted to feature my adopted home of Western Massachusetts because it gets ignored a lot. I'm going to start, here's the agenda here. We're going to recover lost history today too. That's going to be important for you folks for reasons I think will become clear pretty soon. So without further ado, I want to talk a little bit, first of all, about to kind of set the standard here. Something that's missing from you. I didn't write about this in the book because I feature things that we can see. But this sits on your green, but you can't see it. These are some old historical photos, courtesy of the Jones Library. They were so kind as to look these up for me and send them on to me. I'm going to use one in Lee to talk about what you might be able to do here in Amherst. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit, if any of you heard this talk, big talks before, you know, I like to start by talking about my own relationship to oddities. So when I was a kid, I grew up in South Central Pennsylvania. I grew up with a blue-collar family. We didn't go on long vacations or anything like that. But this was like 2.5 hours away from my house, my home in South Central PA. Roadside Americans. I know you've been there. I could easily ask why, but we can talk about it. Cool. But you know, it was. I loved this as a young person because it was like the world's largest train set. Right? But again, there's always a why behind this stuff. So it's a series of little miniature villages with trains run through from different periods of time. And so the why behind it is it's telling a tale about communities in America and kind of like how Americans adjust to technology and those sorts of things. And it kind of staggered me, really. So I started thinking about those kinds of things. And then as a college student, I read that book, In Small Things Forgotten, An Archaeology of Early American Life by James Keats. Wonderful book. It reminds us that even small things can give us some insight into our past. And in this case, one of the things I do talk about is, I guess Pelham was officially part of Amherst, right? You can go up and see that tiny little communion token from the Presbyterian Church up there. It's about the size of a Scrabble tile, and I digitally enhanced it with a P on it so that you could see it. And so I actually tell that story in chapter 26 of the book about that. But I also have been really fascinated by the big things. And in America, you know, go big or go home. So I remember my aunt took me to Atlantic City and showed me Lucy the Elephant, which was actually a hotel at one point. There were a whole bunch of these, actually. And of course, then I saw the Paul Bunyan statue later on. And Paul Bunyan tells a story about conquered wilderness, really. And it's one of the stories that we like to tell as Americans about how we tamed the wild land and all that kind of thing. And then a little bit later on, I took a trip across the country on a bus, and I begged the bus driver to stop at the world's largest prairie dog in Kansas. As it turns out, he was going to anyhow because it's really the only place where you can get a greasy hamburger on that stretch of Interstate 70. But But, you know, that one's obviously not anything particularly important. It's an advertising come on. It's a rather ugly one. In fact, I was kind of disappointed by that, but nonetheless. Well, we have our own silly things here in Western Mass. Now, I didn't write about this because this is like the world's largest prairie dog. This is beaver stealth storage in Lee. Okay, it doesn't really look like a beaver to me. It looks like maybe like a woodchuck crossed with a, I don't know, gopher or something like that. But I couldn't really write about it because there's nothing to say except it's made out of concrete, it's painted, and it's weird. And that doesn't really make a good chapter. But it's clearly a kind of an advertising thing, and still is. Well, these things have a little bit better whys behind. This chapter 4, I talk about the Whately Hill Bog, which I assume a lot of you in here have seen. I tell the story behind that here, and maybe some of you have seen the big chair in Gardner as well. And I tell the story behind that. In this case, this tells us some story about agriculture in Western Massachusetts. This tells us about when Gardner was the furniture capital of the world. And sadly, it also tells us a story about deindustrialization. It tells us about jobs that are no longer there. So these are our kind of Western Mass eye catchers. I also wanted to feature Western Mass because, let's face it, Boston dominates the Commonwealth. This is our idea of high rises around here. This was a beautiful day. I took this up from the top of the campus center at UMass. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that the UMass Library is the tallest building in all of Western Mass. There might be a building in Springfield which is taller, but I'm not sure about that. Okay. Well, the interesting thing about this is when I first proposed this book, several publishers said to me, wow, great idea. If you include things from Boston, we'll publish it. And that, to me, that felt like, you know, well, why don't you just slap me and say that Western Mass is irrelevant? And this was taken during a time in which I helped organize a conference at UMass. And I had some very, very good friends in academic institutions in Boston. And some of them came out here and were shocked that UMass was as big and as impressive as it was and so forth. And I remember saying to one of my friends what did you think? We all walked around barefoot on dirt roads out here? And you know, that's amusing, but the thing is, amusement can kind of mutate into insult at some point. This is not working for some reason here, okay?
I can do it for you. I can get it here.
Okay, I'll just give you the signal. Okay, so that's one, please. So listen, these are some of my favorite insults about Western Massachusetts. One of which was the Big Dig. Remember how we all complained endlessly every time a pothole would get filled out here? All the money was going to go to the Big Dig. This Big Dig ended up costing something like 10 times more than it was supposed to cost, and all of that. These two folks are here for different reasons. Dan Shaughnessy, remember when UMass was #1 in the nation in basketball? When Marcus Candy was over here? Yeah. Dan Shaughnessy was staggered by that. And so in the sports pages of Boston Globe, he referred to our flagship university as UMass Hooterville. I think he's repented from that. He better, because I just gave this new book a good reviews. If not, I'm going to pull it from publication. And there's Mitt Romney down here. Now, you know, a lot of people actually thought Mitt Romney ended up being a pretty decent governor and seemed like a nice enough guy and everything. But you remember in 1994, he ran for the U.S. Senate against Ted Kennedy, which was not a good thing if you were hoping to get elected running against Kennedy at that point. But Romney pledged at that point that he was so bent on being the next U.S. Senator that he planned to canvass the entire state, quotation marks, from Boston to Worcester. I remember joking with people at UMass who said, "Oh, were 11 people in Western Mass that voted for Mitt. But anyhow, and so there were some reasons. Next slide. Next one. Next slide. Yeah. The capital is in Boston, so we have to ask ourselves, why is it in Boston? I grew up in Pennsylvania. Capital is Harrisburg, not Philadelphia, not Pittsburgh, Harrisburg. And if you lived in New York State, if you grew up in New York State, if you grew up in Brooklyn or Queens, you're probably appalled by this. Capital, of course, is in Albany, not New York City. Okay. Now, there are some reasons for that. Next slide. When this country was founded, 1776, where, of course, the Declaration of Independence, 1783, the year that the Constitution was ratified, Boston was the second largest city in all of America. Now, more significant, 11 of the 39 largest cities were in Massachusetts. However, none of them was west of Andover. And you can see the population of Amherst at this point in time, 1,233. Hadley, 882. And actually, once you got west of Worcester, it was Pittsfield and Northampton. Those were the two biggest towns, not Springfield at that point. Okay. Now, that meant that, of course, Eastern Massachusetts was where trade happened, trade and commerce. Western Massachusetts was farming and raw materials, trees, and crops, that kind of thing. Well, it's still that way. About 70% of all residents of Massachusetts live inside of Route 128. So, though we like to complain about Boston consuming resources, that is where the bulk of the population lives. Now, of course, there's nothing, however, that is written in stone that Boston has to be the capital. So what I have here are the 13 original colonies, and the ones in red are the only places that did not move their capital. Now, Trenton stayed the capital because of huge pottery industry there. Rhode Island hardly counts because all of Rhode Island is seaboard, right? But Massachusetts remained Boston. Okay, if you were in Delaware, you went from the coast in Newcastle interior to Dover. If you were in South Carolina, the coast in Charleston to Columbia. Okay, and that happened all around the United States. This is what happened. Okay? And that's had to do with people moving away from the seaboard, population growth, looking for better farmland. That was a huge one. We can be very romantic about salt marsh farms and everything, but that doesn't hold a candle to Hadley Loam. Okay, it just doesn't. And new lands are acquired, and unfortunately, we Native Americans off the land, and that caused people in the West as well. So, added up, this was the first thing that struck me when I moved here, is that people out here loved all the Boston sports teams, and they hated everything else about Boston. The possible exception in the MFA. I love you. And for the record, I don't hate Boston, but I was very amused by all of this. And I think a lot of it, however, the resentment comes from the sense of being ignored, of being an afterthought. And so that was one of the reasons I wrote it. I wrote this book. So what I want to do is recover some Western Massachusetts history and tales. There's that fountain in by the way, on your brain. And this is the hedges before it became the Amherst Women's Club in 1922. And I have to say, you folks did a wonderful job. It looked like it was maybe a little bit down on the spot by that time period. It's such an elegant house. I'm really happy with this still here. But as we do Western Mass history, and I'm going to challenge you folks to do so. I'm going to give you your cheat sheet or your crime scene investigation kit, if you will, here. The first thing I did when I did this book is I started talking to other people. I said, "What is this?" I got all kinds of stories, and when I say all kinds of stories, I mean all kinds of stories. So the second thing you have to do is you have to be skeptical about those things, not cynical, but don't accept what you hear at face value. I have a story in here about the time that I didn't embarrass myself. And then theorize about what other possibilities exist. And once you've done that, then start doing your homework. Start looking for what the visual clues tell you. Start looking at what archival materials tell you. Start looking at what journals and records tell you, and all that kind of thing. And only then and only then, can you be Sherlock Holmes and make an inductive judgment about what these things meant based on the best available evidence. Uh-oh, there it is again. Except now it's in a green box. And you know what? It wasn't in a green box when I first came here as a graduate student, PhD student in 1985. And I had so forgotten about it. I wasn't even sure the box was still there. So I actually called the Amherst Historical Commission and said, is it still there? And they said, and then they were kind of interesting. I think so. and this man over there named Ben, who walked over and he took a picture of it and sent me this picture. So thank you for that. Okay. So in this case, however, we do know what it is. It was a fountain. This humble fountain, and we can infer from this picture, visual context, it was probably built maybe towards the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century, because we have the streets here are still dirt, and we have a horse and buggy over here, and then we have a roadster over here. But you know, there's a fountain again. It was put up by the Women's Christian Temperance. Okay. And this their symbol is a white ribbon for that's a kind of temperance pledge that people take. Okay. And it's now part of your North Amherst, North Commons redevelopment plan. I'll get back to that in just a moment. Well, there's a problem with this. And one of the reasons maybe why it was covered up. When we think about temperance today, it is the great failure. Right? It is the movement which was, even look at the visual clues here again. This U.S. is voted dry, big, bold, screaming headlines, no pictures. Okay. Went into effect in 1920, is repealed and taken out of use in 1933, January 17, 1933. And look at these pictures. Prohibition ends at last. And people in a grand party mood and all of that. Okay. Now the visual clues suggest that this was prohibition was a bad thing. And so do some others. Some of you maybe know the story of Carrie Nation. She's probably the most infamous of all the anti-alcohol crusaders, named Hatchet Granny. She's from Kansas. And from 1894 on, she was so zealous about this that she took her hatchet and she'd go to saloons and she would chop them up and everything. She was arrested a whole bunch of times. She was kind of like an anti-alcohol Francis Crowe. She was arrested so many times. And she inspired other people to do the same. So there's kind of a lot of vandalism involved in this. And so that didn't help the temperance movement's reputation in history. Well, it's not that simple. And first of all, when you talk about this issue, you have to get into some definitions. Like when I would talk about, we need to talk about some definitions to my students. Their eyes would glaze over, maybe start staring at the ceiling or phones or whatever. But they're really important because there's some various words here that are not necessarily the same. If you say that you are abstemious or that you are on an abstinence program, that means you as an individual have voluntarily decided that you're not going to consume alcohol. Doesn't mean that I'm going to tell Hank he can't have any, or I can tell Charlie that she can't have any, or anything else like that. So, prohibition. that's what we were talking about with the 18th Amendment. That is a legal definition. It means nobody can consume it legally. Almost nobody. There were lots of loopholes here. Temperance doesn't mean either of those things necessarily. Temperance, the word temperate is right in it, right? It means that you moderate your intake to level of self-control. So Carrie Nation was a prohibitionist. She was not a temperance advocate. Now, or was she? That gets confusing too, because most temperance advocates, or a lot of them, I wouldn't say most, a lot of them, have some kind of uncomfortable mix of all of these things. And it depends on who you were talking to, what their actual agenda was. So, sorry. Let's try that again. Okay. Now, what all of them had in common, however. Okay, some of them were prudes. Carrie Nation was clearly a prude. Most of them, however, viewed themselves as social reformers. Social reformers. I'll come back to that a little bit too. Okay. The visual clues suggest that they had a lot of company, because there were lots of temperance fountains built all across the country, and including here in our area. Holyoke, Westfield, Orange, one in Orange is actually rather elaborate, and one in Lee that I'll be talking about. And I guess that Hadley and Conway also had temperance fountains, but nobody talked to yet seems to know what happened. But I'll track that down at some point. And it wasn't just in the boondocks, Washington, D.C., New York City. So this tells us that this is a broad-based movement. Well, here's the person I'm going to be talking about. I could have, as I said, I would have written about the Amherst Fountain if A, it was in view, and B, if I knew where to find some answers about who was involved in it. And I don't know those things yet. That's maybe your task, and so forth. This one in Lee is an interesting one to study for various reasons. If you has anybody ever seen it? Well, if you're like going to Tanglewood or someplace like that and you go through Lee, you get off the bike, it's turning towards the outlet malls, you go into the town of Lee. Right as you come around the big bend onto Main Street from Park Street, there's a kind of almost like a parklet in the park there, and it's there. Okay. It wasn't always there, and I'll get to that in just a second as well. But this one actually tells us a lot of different things about it, and it was carved by Daniel Chester French. I see that rings a lot of bells. If it doesn't ring any bells for you, or if you're trying to place it, next slide. He's the guy who did the Lincoln Memorial. He's also the guy who did the Minuteman statue in Concord, and he was the preeminent sculptor of his day. And you can visit his studio in Stockbridge, which is called Chesterwood. And it's quite a place. Have you ever been there? Yeah, it's certainly worth a visit. Okay. Well, in this case, his fountain has three purposes. This is the front of the fountain. You can see it says Chief Conquerpot, and the chief is in quotation marks because he was a bit more than a chief. He was a sage, which is the principal chief. So that's like the chief of chiefs. Okay? And it's also kind of an amusing pun if you're into puns, because a pot is actually 1/2 of the imperial pint of beer. And so the fun part of it, if you drink enough of those pots, then you get calmed out. But anyhow, this, more importantly, Chief Conquerpot and a couple other Mohicans in that region are the ones who sold land to English settlers. This was not a conquest. This was a sale, and it was a mutual thing, and there were schools set up American, Native Americans and so forth. And it led to the development, English development of the Berkshires, Stockbridge being the first of those towns. And then, of course, our third purpose, second purpose here, sees a fish here. There's some debate what that fish is. Is it a trout, Atlantic salmon, shad, what is it? But in this case, it doesn't matter because the purpose of this was to represent the Housatonic River, which flows through the lake. And in fact, where you see it today isn't where it originally stood. It's originally down on Railroad Street. You know it's Railroad Street, that's right as you cross the railroad tracks, that's Railroad Street. And it's on the banks of the Housatonic River, so that made sense. The person we're going to talk about is Amelia Jeanette Kilden. She's the reason for what happened here. Okay? And here it is. Here she is, lovely young woman. And you can see she died young. She was 47 when she died. She's in the Smith College class of 1892, so here's the Pioneer Valley connection. Okay. And that's actually, just, is it 17 years? 17 years after the college was founded. So she's an early Smith grad. And the next slide gives us the biography of her. It is a thin one because she did die so young. And she came from a solid middle class family, not kind of Gilded Age, Robert Weir type family, but a very respectable family involved with the Congregational Church. What else would you have been in the 19th century? Western Massachusetts, a Congregationalist. Okay? And even in high school, she was interested in temperance. And she brought that with her to Smith when she went there. Her brother became a Congregationalist minister and graduated from Smith with a straight C average. I'm careful. For reasons that are completely mysterious, including people of the Sophia Smith collection with whom I've talked about, in those days, D was the highest grade you could get. And A meant barely passing. So we would say today that she was a straight B student, a straight C student. And again, I'd love to know why. When I talked to them at the archives, they didn't know exactly when she changed it. But at one point, they just turned it upside down. You can see after she graduates, she goes back to the league. She's very involved in the temperance movement, particularly with the LTL, which is the League Temperance League, which is an affiliate of the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, for children. And she was involved with children's art, making art that was, again, talk about the allure of being young when you should avoid it. And then she died of consumption. That's the old name for tuberculosis. So at age 27, Amelia Kilden died. But we have to go again on this idea of prudery about temperance. This is a very, very old idea in America. One of our founding fathers, probably founding mothers too. Memory serves, I think Abigail Adams has some problems with alcohol consumption as well. But Dr. Benjamin Rush opposed it. He had all these medical reasons why this child was. And this rather stern-looking individual is Reverend Lyman Beecher, the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and his son was the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, probably the most famous minister of the late 19th century, the mid-19th century, I should say. And he was the founder of the first temperance society in 1826. It's very early. Okay? The American Society for the Promotion of Temperance. Back one, please. Oh, did it? Oh, no, sorry, you had the right one. Yeah, I wanted to, back one, please. I wanted to mention this slide here. You probably can't read this from where you're sitting, but this is the Drunkard's Progress. I mean, obviously, we're doing something on a play on Pilgrim's Progress. But it starts out here, step one is a glass of beer with friends. And by step 4, you're drunk and ribald. By step 5, you're a confirmed alcoholic, and then it's all downhill. Poverty, your friends were forsake you, you're desperate and turn to crime, and finally you kill yourself. Now, we chuckle about those sort of things today, but this is, okay, now next slide, please. The amount of alcohol consumed in America at this period of time was staggering. A historian by the name of Robert Weir wrote a book in which he referred to it as an alcoholic republic. Didn't say alcohol consuming or alcohol preferring, an alcoholic republic. Amounts of beer, wine, whiskey, sherry, hard cider, rum that you can't even fathom. And there's maybe some reasons for that too. And it's not an accident that there were so many temperance societies. Okay, now the American Temperance Society had 1.5 million members by 1834, 5. That's out of a population that's under 4 million. Okay? So roughly 1/4 of all American men, women, and children were members of a temperance society. And you would certainly never know it by walking across the campus on Friday or Saturday night. But Amherst College had 3 temperance societies, and staggering 3/4 of all of its students signed a temperance pledge. The other quarter perhaps made up for it, I don't know. But again, this doesn't mean abstinence. It doesn't mean prohibition. It means temperance. Okay? It means a voluntary reduction of your alcohol consumption. It would have been, if you took the pledge, it would have been shameful to be seen drunk. It would have been shameful to have to be picked up off the floor or anything of that nature. Certainly, it would have been just beyond the ken to have become an actual alcoholic. Here's the other thing that happened at this period of time. Look at religion. I think I'll just place collection plate. No, your collection plate at the back, $20. Anyhow, from time to time, we have religious revivals in there. The first one was Jonathan Edwards, what we call the First Awakening. They call these things the awakenings. The first one was Jonathan Edwards. The second Great Awakening, which happens between 1834 and 1845, is a bit different. Jonathan Edwards is all about sin. The second Great Awakening is all about self-control and perfecting yourself. Something that Edwards would. He's probably still spending his grave about that idea. Millions of people would convert. As a result of that, we get a whole bunch of new temperance societies. There is the Washingtonian Society, the Father Matthew with 1 T, which started in Ireland and came to the United States with Irish immigrants. They had a reputation for hard drinkers, so some of them were very abstemious. That's because they were concerned about the reputation of the Irish. They didn't want the Irish to be associated with drunkenness. There was even a total abstinence society. Massachusetts had 60 temperance journals. You go down to the local news agent and you could pick up a temperance journal or 2 or 3 or 6. Tons of them. And this is your quiz question for after the talk. There were 5 times more temperance societies and temperance activists than there were anti-slave activists. Why? And we'll get to that one. Now I'm going to show you a bestseller. I'm sure you'll all be rushing out to get this. 10 Nights in the Bar Room, and What I Saw There by Timothy Shea Arthur. And there is young Mr. Arthur, the writer of this. And we look at it and I say it's a bestseller. I mean that. It's just the 3rd largest selling, some would say 4th, it goes back and forth to 3 and 4. But in the entire 19th century, the only novels that outsold this were Ben-Hur, that's number 1. And that hardly counts because I think that was published in 1898. And Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the cover pretty much tells you what it's about. Look at the visual clues here again. There's a man, and there's a woman hanging from his sleeve. We don't know if it's his daughter or into a Greek novel, which I know you're all going to rush out to. if it's his daughter, if it's his wife, and you can see she's trying to drag him out of the bar. He's looking over his shoulders at all his comrades there that are getting soused at the bar and so forth. And from there, the book is pretty much like that Drunkard's Progress that I showed you earlier. Virtually everything that you can imagine, from unemployment, poverty, and gambling to domestic abuse, accidents, and early death, occur in this book. It's your basic, cheery book. So anyhow, so it shouldn't surprise you though that women were especially active in the temperance movement. The saloon and public culture were almost entirely male preserves. And because almost no women worked outside the home, they had no disposable income other than what their husbands gave them. And they suffered disproportionately when the family income was wasted in bars, or the husband became a drunkard or whatever, and domestic abuse rates soared. Divorce was rare. Domestic abuse was common. Abandonment for women of wives was common. Getting a divorce, very, very hard. So it shouldn't surprise us that they became crusaders. This. Now, given that it was the 19th century, they didn't lead these temperance societies usually. Men were the heads of them, but their membership was predominantly women. Excuse me. That's going to be one of the things that's going to move from temperance to a kind of movement towards prohibition. It's clear that all these pledges they're not working, right? So what do you do instead? Well, maybe we just need to get rid of it. Maybe it really is demon wrong. And religious work in the 19th century, maybe it really is demon wrong. You see that Maine abolished alcohol in 1851, and Massachusetts was just 1 year behind it. In 1852, we abolished alcohol in Massachusetts. Now, the problem was, just as quickly as a lot of these states abolished it, they became unabolished, as it were. They were repealed. It had a lot to do with working class Finns and Irish and German brewers and the politicians who wanted to get votes. Was it still a time period which you could take people in the saloon and drunk and they vote for? So they were quickly repealed. So the movement then kind of mutates into a call for constitutional amendment. Clearly, we're not going to be able to do this on our own. So the second and third word of which is temperance, we could actually call them prohibition movements. A lot of them. We get new ones. Anti-Saloon League, that was the one Carrie Nation was associated with. Catholic Total Abstinence Society, the Salvation Army, and Women's Christian Temperance. Founded in 1874, it was pretty small until its second president, which is Frances Willard, a very dynamic individual, and she basically, temperance wasn't big enough for her. Okay, prohibition wasn't big enough. She had to do all philosophy. She wanted to get rid of tobacco, prostitution, and gambling, and she was a peace advocate, supported labor unions, and all that kind of thing. Suffrage, she was a suffragette. Very dynamic. The WCTU under her also was really controversial. Stuff in yellow, the stuff which today we would consider to be relatively controversial. Americanization programs, we weren't talking about bilingual education back in those days. We're talking about how to make them into Americans, and that was basically how to make them into German or English Americans, that kind of thing. They were anti-premarital sex, blue laws. Remember blue laws? When everything used to be closed on Sunday? WCTU had something to do with that. They're not the only ones. They were also eugenics advocates. Breeding, special breeding, to make sure that wrong people don't breed. It's kind of controversial as well. Publicly Christian and publicly anti-gay. Now, I want to say publicly anti-gay because there is substantial evidence that Frances Willard was a lesbian. Okay, so wasn't always consistent to their own principles. replace it with? Can we replace it? Tea and coffee, some people had problems with those too because they were addicted. Caffeine is an addictive substance. Okay? But there were some tea houses. But basically, these ribbons tell us what they were about. It says cold water on it. They wanted to convert people to the glories of consuming cold water rather than alcohol. And there's serious treatises. If you look at some medical literature of the day that talks about all the benefits of it, and it's dubious science, pseudoscience, a lot of it. But nonetheless, one of the kind of fallouts that you see every day about this is that in America, you find water fountains everywhere. You go to school with water fountain basically every hallway. You go to a public building, there's a water fountain. You go on, you walk around the streets, there's a water fountain. That's not the case in a lot of places in Europe. A lot of places in Europe, you just don't find that. And the cold water movement is one of the reasons. It was actually called the cold water movement at this point. And there's a big problem with it. Several big problems. I'll get to these guys over here in just a second. But this is the water bubbler as you know it. And look at the date on it. It's after 1920. It was invented, I think, 1921. I have to look at that. Benson is the person who came up with it. It's got the safety guard that makes the water safer to consume. Prior to that, here's your public drinking fountain. And down here it says, replace the cup. They don't mean get rid of the cup. They mean you dip your cup in the water, and after you have your drink, you put it back in the water. Okay. You know, can you say cholera, typhoid, dysentery, hepatitis? They were not sick. There was no treated water until after 1902. And that wasn't treated the way that you and I would think it would be treated today. There were no purity regulations until 1914. So one of the reasons that people consume so much alcohol is, of course, when you create alcohol, you boil the water or you use distilled water, right? And that was, so there's a problem with that. There was also an aesthetic problem. This was the biggest builder of temperance fountains in the country at this time, Dr. Henry Caldwell, excuse me. And people thought his fountains were relentlessly ugly. So ugly that they were vandalized on a routine basis. Okay. Most of them had a heron at the top. It's a water bird, get it? So that was kind of an issue. But that was the real problem was it just wasn't safe to drink water necessarily. Nonetheless, we know what happened. The 18th Amendment goes into effect, and Massachusetts is the 11th state to sign on to it. You needed 36 votes at that point because there were only 48 states. Alaska and Hawaii were not states, and all of that. The tide had turned, and people had associated so many social problems with alcohol that they felt that they needed to have a constitutional amendment. And of course, we absolutely know what the impact of that was. But at the time, it was in effect. The WCTU was a major movement. You see it. It had more than 750,000 people by 1927. They had two conferences in Boston and one in Hartford in the late 19th and early 20th century. And there were still people taking the white ribbon pledge. I don't know why you needed to take the pledge after 1920, because if you hadn't taken the pledge, you were a scofflaw. Well, turns out there were millions of those, but there it is. What this tells us immediately, though, is that the WCTU was not a failure. It was actually an extremely So, it's what we don't know. I don't know. Maybe some of you do. If you do, I'd be happy to, I'd love to hear from you. I don't know who the Amherst Amelia killed is. I don't know who was responsible for that family up there. Next one. It doesn't mean you can't do your own investigation. You should ask who were the movers and the shakers. You should ask who paid for the thing. Is there a paper trail that we can follow? All those kinds of things. And maybe a lot of you do this, maybe some of you just know more about what happened here than I do, because I haven't been able to find it thus far. So, kind of my last wrapping it up here. We know it was repealed in 1933, but one thing you should not do in your doing in history, I had to talk to my students about this a lot of times. I wanted to root for people. I said, no, you can root for people. Yeah, there are good people and bad people, but history is history, right? And you can't assume that just because something grew unpopular over time, it's a bad idea, or we have a bunch of pranks, or any of that kind of thing. You have to ask the why behind it again. So it's an extremely popular movement in some way. I have two more slides, but I'm going to pause for a second and ask if anybody has a theory about why there were more temperance advocates than there were anti-slavery advocates. Would anybody like to add to that? Temperance was also a movement in the South, right? There were not anti-slavery groups in the South, and so that had a lot to do with it. It also had to do with the fact that temperance was a very middle class movement. The middle class was rising at this period of time. So anyhow, your Commons Development program here in Amherst was passed in 2016. You can go on the city website here and you can look at, you can read this plan. And there is in the plan the idea of restoring the fountain. Now I say that's in the plan, that's 2016, that's five and a half years ago. Okay? And as you know, plans have a way of cutting corners when money is tight. So if you're thinking about, oh yeah, well, we don't have to worry about it, we're going to know the answer to this, maybe not. You probably need to get in touch with your historical commission here in town and say, you know, we want to make sure that this is part of the history that we tell here in Amherst. Otherwise, it could go by the wayside. So that's your challenge. And here's the rest. I'm going to open up to questions. If I have some books for sale after the talk and after our chat and everything here today, the $20, which means I'm saving you 18 cents on tax. But if you want to buy more, it makes a great gift for all holidays, including Arbor Day. But you can get it at Leverage Press, right up here on the Common. You can also, if you're in Northampton, you can get a broadside. Leverage Press is part of the collected copies, by the way, up here. And if you order it by mail, I would ask that you please order from collected copies from Leverage Press rather than on Amazon. That's just Jeff Bezos doesn't need money. If you get it from Leverage, then the money stays here locally. It's got a very, very long URL, but my friend of mine created a tiny URL. So it's called tinyurl.com/who knew Rob. You can probably remember that. And there's some of the other stuff that's in there. I kind of highlighted a little bit when I was talking, when I was reading. You can find out about Big Indian, as it's called, on Mohawk Trail. You can find out why does Conway have such a fancy library. You can find out about the Hadley Green, because its green was always a green. I never great to tell you it's a but you want to find out about covered bridges. You can find out about the eccentric who built an amazing house in Cherryham. Did you know that we have an official Massachusetts Peace Monument? And it's in orange. You find out about that. You found out all about curling before we even wanted to go gold medal. Did you know that there's a Titanic museum in Springfield? It's kind of a crazy little place, but anyhow, the Skinner and other things like that. So I've talked enough here, and I'm going to open it up and see if anybody has any questions. No questions, come on. Yes.
What's your favorite leader?
I get asked that a lot, actually, and it's a great question. And I get asked, what's my favorite one, and what did I enjoy the most? And I have to be really frank about that. The answer is, I was having so much fun. This book was supposed to be out before the COVID lockdown. I was having too much fun researching. So my favorite one was whatever I was researching at the time. In terms of pure weird, I mean, the Whitley book was kind of weird. But it's fun. It's fun. The big chairs, that's weird. But I really have a favorite. That's it's kind of like asking what your favorite child or something. It's a great question, and I wish I had a better answer for it. But I don't. I can tell you the first one that I researched was the monument on West Street in Northampton, because that was the one that embarrassed me. I told all my students it was a place where two Irish guys were hanged in 1806, and it ain't no such thing. But that's what people swore to me that's what it was, and that was where I didn't do what a good historian would do. I wasn't skeptical. So that one has I won't say one place in my heart, but it kind of sticks me in the side every time I pass it by. And I pass it by a lot because I have to pass it by when I go into my house in Florence and other questions? Did we know anything about temperance movement here in Youngstown? Yes, Dan, please.
I would just like to bring up that there's now tours to see the plaques that were made of the Civil War. I read about it in the senior. My husband was for years trying to get those displayed in the town hall, on the town common, or someplace. But now you can see those, and everybody has a Civil War monument or something, but not Amherst. But I do remember on the Amherst Common, the Women Temperance Union fountain, we arrived in 1971. So I've seen that.
It was here when it was unboarded when I came here in '85. And I'm racking my brain trying to remember exactly when it was covered up. I think it was sometime in the early '90s. But by the time that I was here, there wasn't any water coming out the top. It was just a trough down below that dogs were lapping on.
So it did work.
They did. They worked in the '70s. Yeah.
Why did they close it?
That's a good question. I was told, I didn't check it out, because again, when I was doing this book, I could only write about things that people could see. I was told it's because the plumbing had corroded. And that's probably true. If it was built and I assumed that it was built, it's probably true that it corroded. So they probably have to do some look up, have to put in a new line, that's all that good. Other questions? Yes, in the back.
Were there any weird news about garden or natural elements, or is all the built world that you look at?
It has to have something that has a history behind it, because that's what I did. But there are some very unusual gardens around here. I didn't do well. Actually, I take that back. There is one that I read about, the Three Sisters Sanctuary up in Goshen, which is a spectacular place. And so's the weird stove shop. That's another weird one, by the way. The Big Tin Man from the stove shop at the Three Sisters Sanctuary. And I had a long discussion with Richard Richardson, who built that place, about it. And he likes to talk about it. But he didn't build the Tin Man, by the way. He traded for it. You can't get any more in the way than that. But on gardens, I'm already collecting some information if I ever decide to do who knew too. It has a ring to So if you know some really unusual parts, let me know. But I guess there's one that's actually near that house down Cherryham, Ashton or something like that. Any others? Well, thank you so much for your attention. And if I don't have my coffee in the morning, I'm legally dead until I.
Let's get some refreshment. Come on and join us.
Sheridan Johnson was.
This is actually great.
No, I think it's first.
That's right. Sure now. Oh, you. I just didn't want to flex with it too much. To run away this. Yeah, okay, it's working fine. Yeah, okay. Sorry about that.
Oh, this is the, I thought it was a sticker for a minute.
I mean, my. This is a cursed. This is a cursed.
Well, let's see. Kay's iPad, just iPad, and those K. Yeah, and another iPad. And then I know that Monterey was there.
Nice.